Welcome to episode 138 of Silver Lining for Learning. We have had, in recent months, several episodes about the exciting innovations that are taking place in education in India. And this is continuing that series. And in particular, we're looking at experiential learning today at scale. We know that experiential learning is much more powerful than teaching by telling and learning by listening. But it's also more complicated, which is one of the reasons that we don't see more of it in education. Azra and Aditya have two different programs that both involve experiential learning and both are moving towards scale. So we're excited to learn more about what they're doing, and we're also excited to have a conversation about the models that they're using, opportunities for scale, how to overcome challenges, and so on. So I'll ask each of them to introduce themselves and say a little about their program. And Azra, I'll start with you.
Sure, I'm Azra Ismail. I'm the co-founder of Maker Ghat. We're a nonprofit based in India focused on hands-on learning and making among underserved youth across the country. We've worked with almost 500,000 youth, ranging from the states of Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra to Kerala, Odisha, and just adding new states to our roster very, very quickly. I'm also currently finishing up my PhD at Georgia Tech in the Human-Centered Computing program, where my PhD is at the intersection of human-computer interaction and global development. I'm really excited to talk more about my work at Maker Ghat today.
And my name is Aditya. I am the co-founder and CEO of Inspirit VR. This is a company that is aspiring to build experiential learning opportunities using new technologies like virtual reality and augmented reality, with really a serious focus on thinking about how we can meaningfully and sustainably integrate these tools into K-12 classrooms in a way in which it's not just something that's novel and something that's cool in the beginning and then ends up being another tool that's collecting dust on the shelf. Our mission really is to work at the intersection of the learning sciences and the cutting edge nature of these technologies to build VR curriculums in STEM that truly can drive meaningful opportunities for experiential discovery and learning in these topics. We were founded out of Stanford University, which is where I was completing a PhD in the Learning Sciences program at the School of Education. And since then have been working with dozens of districts across the United States of all shapes and sizes, Title I, and other kinds. And more recently, in the last, I would say, 6 to 9 months, we have started to really scale up in India in ways in which I had never imagined would be possible in such a short timeline. And I'm excited to share more of some of those ideas. Separately, I actually also have known Azra through the Maker Ghat days. I also was part of the founding team at Maker Ghat and have spent a lot of time again in classrooms of all shapes and sizes in India, growing up, being either a researcher or a teacher or a volunteer in these spaces. So thanks for having us today.
So I'll start with a question. We've had other episodes of Silver Lining for Learning that talk about implementing advanced technologies, and certainly making and immersive learning are advanced technologies in global South countries. And one of the things that the leaders who are doing this have said is that they have to fight kind of a deficit model. So it's like, you're doing something so exotic, shouldn't you just be doing basic reading and math, to help these poor marginalized students? And in fact, as you know, nobody should be getting remediation. Everybody should be getting enrichment. And all of us have strengths and weaknesses, so deficit models are really inappropriate. But I'm wondering if you have to do kind of an elevator pitch to explain why you're doing something like making your VR within the country of India, which in many ways has a rather traditional school system. At least that's my impression.
Yeah, I can maybe take a first stab at this, and I'm sure Aditya will have a slightly different angle at this question. So I think with Maker Ghat, it's been interesting because we're kind of straddling that space in the nonprofit sector, where on one hand, a lot of the discourse around bringing hands-on learning and making has been very focused on these high-end robotics kits and Lego Mindstorms and all of these things that are frankly just not sustainable and not affordable for the vast majority of the Indian audience. And what we've been saying is that you don't really need to go after those tools. There's a lot you can do with materials that are readily available to you, that are locally produced, that are going to be much easier to sustain in our school systems or in our community spaces, right, where hands-on learning and tinkering can happen. So on one hand, that's the discourse that we've been dealing with, where a lot of people talking about STEM are like, oh, this is what STEM looks like. It's about shiny new tech, but it's not just that. It can look in a lot of different ways, and that's kind of the beauty of it. That's kind of also why it's so powerful. On the other hand, though, we also have this because we are in the nonprofit sector, we kind of fit in the social sector, we're working with government. There's also this push of like, oh, we should just focus on like basic literacy skills, basic numeracy skills, and that's all that we care about with this audience. And at the same time, we're like, no, that's not what we want. Like, yes, that those are important skills, but that doesn't mean that these children don't deserve to have the best education, to have access to experiential learning, to find new ways to imagine and learn and be creative. So that's also been a narrative that we've been constantly coming up against. I think what like we've been lucky in some sense that we've entered the space at a time where there has been a growing recognition that we need to be engaging in offering like 21st century skills is a catch-all phrase now in India because partly because also of the new education policy 2022 that was 2020 that was released. So there is like a growing recognition that okay, we care about creativity, we care about critical thinking, we care about building self-efficacy, all of these things among students, and that these are mediums through which that can happen alongside traditional education systems, unfortunately, which we're just like a whole beast that we've been saddled with. So that's kind of, I think we've been in a space where we're lucky that that conversation is happening and we are able to kind of work with that, at the same time also having to push the narrative on both of those sides to say no, there is a space for this kind of work to happen, and this is a really good time to be pushing that work forward right now in India because we have the right space, the right energy, the right resources to make that happen. So that's been the Maker Ghat side. I'm curious what Aditya has to say.
I mean, I'll add to that. I think that was amazing. And I'll add to that with saying that traditionally, we've really taken a deficit model to thinking about development or to thinking about learning as well in a classroom, which is, oh, the teachers are not trained, or there isn't electricity, there isn't infrastructure, there aren't tables and chairs, there isn't whatever, right? XYZ, there aren't meaningful opportunities for work for students and for youth. And I think when you frame the question looking at the gaps and looking at the deficits, you miss out on the assets and you miss out on the unique affordances that may not be obvious, may not be physical in nature. They can be human in nature. They can be skills. They can be different values. They can be different aspirations. Aspiration is an asset as well that one can very powerfully leverage in these spaces. And so we come from that perspective, both with kind of all the work that I aspire to do in India. The idea is, how do we amplify the aspirations of our youth in the country? And technology is just that. Technology is an amplification tool. It's finally a tool. It's not the center of the narrative. And that's an important thing to also keep in mind. We're not trying to push virtual reality because it's the next big thing, or because it's cool, or because it's this fancy new gadget. And I want to be very explicit about that. However, it aligns very deeply with the aspirations of the youth today. They are no longer accepting an education system that is just filling their mind with information. They're asking deeper questions of why. Why should I be learning this? How does this apply to my ability to be a successful citizen in the world tomorrow? And when more and more children, more and more members of the ecosystem start asking these questions, you'll start noticing these legacy systems that were really relics of the colonial era they start crumbling, or they start being tested in a very direct way. And we're seeing signs of that movement happening. It's still tricky because we still come from this mindset of a culture that leans heavily on standardized testing. And so it's very hard to even work with the various stakeholders when you say, look, a tool like this is going to dramatically boost critical thinking skills. The immediate question that comes after that is, how do I measure critical thinking skills? Because it's all about kind of building a rank chart of who's first, who's second, who's third, and who's fourth. And previously it was grade-based and mark-based, which was testing how much information you were able to recall or you were able to remember. And now the same folks want to build these new values and these new skills, not really new, but these kind of these fundamental skills of critical thinking, of self-efficacy. They want to fit it within that same framework of standardized testing, which is there a way to measurably show that someone is thinking more critically than someone else? And I think that's where a lot of work needs to happen, where you have to go back with saying, look, these are not discrete quantities. And maybe the purpose is not to measure if someone is better than somebody else in critical thinking. Maybe the goal is just to create spaces where meaningful discovery, meaningful problem solving can happen, whether it's in the digital world, looking at kind of these new digital tools and technologies, whether it's in the analog, in the physical world, creating maker spaces, creating labs, creating these sorts of open-ended rooms. Just physical space is a big thing that we've seen a lot of students desire, where they can just tinker, where they can fail fast without any consequences in place. So that's kind of the approach we take over here. I think a lot of work, a lot of natural questions that come as pushbacks on measurement when you start thinking about experiential learning tools and scaling those. But taking this assets-based approach is certainly something that we both, and I also firmly believe in, kind of being the way in which we can really leapfrog a lot of the kind of catch up that the Indian education system is trying to do.
Punya, you have a question.
Yeah, so thank you for that the response to the previous question. So I wanted to better understand what your relationship is with public school. I mean, do you exist as like after school or weekend, or do you work in partnership with schools that you're located in the schools? Because I can see that being tricky in and of itself, because the Indian education system, having gone through it myself and having sort of worked with people in that space. So I wonder what kind of sort of relationship how do these two things exist with respect to public schooling or private schools or whatever?
Yeah, I think we might have different relationships with the schooling system. So with Maker Ghat, we work with a range of spaces. So we work with the government school system. We don't work as much with private schools. And there it's a very different beast, where the buy-in typically has to come more top-down, and then a lot of things can happen at the local level. But we also do a lot of work with community spaces. So some of these are after-school centers. Some of these are panchayat libraries. Like, that's been a space that's been really interesting and has worked well for us. Some of these are just like community gathering spots that organizations have been, doing rural development or tribal development work in for several years, and that's become a space for all kinds of activities. So in the school system, it's typically part of the school timetable. It's not an after school activity, it's embedded in the school calendar. But when it's an after school activity, or if it's one of these other spaces, then it becomes a lot more tricky, trying to figure out how to get students to that space. What is the schedule going to look like? All of that. But I think we've been really lucky with the partners we have. We have a very strong, like every program we have very strong partner relationships, which has, and they have a lot of traction in the community. So that's really helped in terms of a lot of those logistical kinds of questions.
Yeah, and similar with Inspirit, we work with both private and public schools. And I think a key goal is there are multiple models that we have designed, multiple pedagogical kind of models in terms of how one can engage with these new tools and these technologies. One is certainly kind of in a traditional classroom. If a teacher was pulling up a PowerPoint presentation, maybe the PowerPoint presentation could be replaced with a deep dive into a cell. Like if you ever watch the TV show, The Magic School Bus, that's really what we're trying to build with with virtual reality. It's kind of this ability for you to shrink in size, enter the human body. So if you're learning about protein synthesis or DNA replication, instead of looking at slides or even a passive YouTube video, it would be much more compelling to replace that point in time in a classroom when you pull up that video, replace that with a headset, or replace that with an experience. Now it gets tricky because with VR, you're now looking at, well, one-to-one, one-to-many, sharing. There's all sorts of other questions that come into play. And we've developed a series of different models that one can use. There are station rotation setups that we have explored. There are one-to-one setups we've explored. There are one-to-many models where there is sharing of a single device or a single headset happening. And then you also have the kind of out of classroom, out of the traditional timetable opportunities for integration, like a lab context, like a library context, where there's actually even more space. You don't have the furniture that can block you from being able to move around and explore and kind of do all of that stuff. So I think the key goal really for both of us was, we did not want either Inspirit or Maker Ghat to become this one other extracurricular activity that's done as an afterthought at the end of the day. Rather, we thought of it really as embedding it in core topics and core curriculums. If you're learning science, if you're learning math, you should be learning it experientially. You should be learning by doing. You should be learning through project-based activities. So that standards alignment, that curriculum alignment, is a big thing that I've seen us do both with Maker Ghat and with Inspirit. In a very foundational way. How does this connect to, in case of India, if there's the NCERT syllabus that's being followed in a CBSE school, which both Azra and I went to growing up, you want to demonstrate that this new intervention or this new workshop or this new activity or this new project is not just boosting one's confidence and self-efficacy and critical thinking and problem-solving skills, which might be too abstract, but it also so happens that it improves their understanding of the topic, of the standard, of the goal that's happening. So if you can do alignment of expectations and goals, saying, look, your kids will also do better on the test because they're no longer memorizing information, but they're actually contextualizing it and they're actively engaging with it in various different ways. So that's a big part of kind of getting buy-in for us to fit into the formal classroom timetable.
Thank you. So, I mean, India has the new educational policy, which I think in many ways does align well with the things that you're saying, at least on paper, right? But I think that gives you an in some ways, given the new policies that just, I think it's been a couple of years, right? So I had a question about funding. How are you guys supporting the work that you do? Because clearly it's happening at a pretty large scale. And then, and maybe some thoughts about how you see like going forward, sort of becoming sustainable or something that way. I was just curious about that.
So, I mean, Inspirit is a for-profit a company. And so our approach is to have the partners we work with, the school or the institution or the parents or the families, pay for this service, just as they would pay for a textbook, just as they would pay for any other digital tool for their learning. We kind of have a traditional kind of edtech subscription model that we offer to our users. A key point here is we're actually going after the dollars that are spent towards textbooks. That's kind of the fundamental kind of goal over here is in many ways, my vision with starting Inspirit was to eventually kill the textbook, especially in a STEM context. Like if it's printed, it's probably already outdated, especially in the context of how fast things are moving in the world today. And so I see that sort of tension that will come, where we have seen pushback from the traditional publishing companies, both in India and the United States, that see us as a direct competitor to what they are doing, to their approach of teaching science or teaching math or teaching STEM in a specific way. With Maker Ghat, it's a nonprofit, and I'll let Azra share a bit more about the.
Yeah, so just a quick comment here. Actually, Aditya, I mean, I really like the fact that it is a for-profit. Yeah, because that way you are building the business models or whatever to survive in that environment, right? I mean, exactly. That there isn't necessarily going to be a boatload of money there, but then whatever you come up with has to live within that. I think there's a lot in India in particular. There's so much happening in the sort of the NGO, outside of the space, which is based on grants and stuff, and which at the end of the day, again, Azra, I don't want to be dinging what you're going to say next.
But I do probably agree 100%.
Yeah, because I think that's rare, because people come in with like well-intentioned and they want to do this work, and the sort of the short-term grant cycle is what keeps it going. But moods change, and suddenly you might be in a dirt. So anyway, I was kind of I did not know that.
Yeah.
And that sort of, I think, sort of sets you in a somewhat of a unique space there.
And also in India, I mean, the buying power of every single individual is increasing
Sure,
over time.
for
And
sure.
the amount that a family spends on ed and education is unbelievable relative
absolutely.
to kind of any other country, actually. If you look at the ratio of their earnings to the spendings on education. So there is definitely an aspiration, and I think it's interesting because these are families that have typically studied, I would say, at least the two generations older than the generations they work with, were in that era right after independence of the country, where it was all about education being the fastest mobility to kind of achieving some sort of kind of socioeconomic growth in their lives. So it's seen as the fundamental driver of development and growth, regardless of the socioeconomic status. When you work with students, and people often challenge me with Inspirit, saying, well, you're building VR, you're selling, you're probably only going to have the rich, wealthy private schools in every city that's actually buying you. But that's not true. We have 2 state government partners that are rolling us out district-wide, from tribal districts and tribal schools to kind of the rural peri-urban schools and classroom. They're all public schools. So I think we have also been able to effectively challenge that idea that public schools don't have the money to pay for something like this. And that's definitely.
So, I mean, at the complete aside here, but one of the most fun exercises to do, I did this a few years back. I think I was in Nagpur, and I just took my camera and I just took a picture of everything related to education that I would see. And you can't go 1 kilometer without at least having 50 pictures. It'll be like programming classes, language, this, +2 coaching. I mean, just broadly, I mean, so you realize that even in which is not a big metro, that education is really seen as the way forward, right? There is no other way. So anyway, good point there. Anyway, Azra, sorry, you've been waiting while I've been hogging, so please go ahead.
No. I mean, I'm glad you said those things, because I think that sets very important context. So I think one thing that happens a lot in the nonprofit sector in India is that we're working on one problem for decades instead of like having addressed that issue and kind of moving on and working on new things, right? I think that one thing for us at Maker Ghat is that like this gap right now in the system, I think, is not that there aren't resources in education. It's that people are not necessarily seeing this as a space where they want to invest funds. And that's where nonprofits or the social sector can fill a gap. So for us, a big kind of mission is really enabling a cultural shift in the sector. So we are kind of that organization that allows a government to see that, okay, this is working, this is what's happening as a result of this kind of program, and now we are willing to invest in this, or now we are willing to kind of revisit our textbooks, revisit our school calendar, create a dedicated space in the school that's for this kind of hands-on activity, right? So I think that's where and again, timing, because of the NEP, because of all of these governments wanting to invest in this, it's been an interesting experience. So for us, yes, we're a significant portion of our activities are funded by grants, but also we have long-term relationships with governments where they've agreed to fund any sustained activities post proof of concept kind of phase, which has also been interesting. So I think we're still waiting to see how much of the actual kind of aspirations get realized at a large scale and actually get embedded, because cultural change, as we know, is very, very hard in the education sector and India with like standardized testing and such. But I think we're starting to see it. We still have, I think, our attention at the wrong things with like coding classes or like White Hat Junior and that kind of thing. But I think in the next 5 years, we'll probably move towards the direction in which we need to go. At least I'm optimistic in that sense. And I see us like in that space, trying to enable a movement, trying to enable a cultural shift more than anything else.
And if I had to kind of reflect on the role of nonprofits as well, especially in an Indian context, the role of a nonprofit is to try to fill in the gaps in kind of deficiency of what the government should be doing. It is trying to offer services where the government is either unable to offer, either because it's too ambitious, it requires significant investment of R&D capital or money, or is something that is just not on the priority list of what the government is trying to do. So in many ways, a successful nonprofit is one that goes out of business. And the goal for all nonprofits, especially us at Maker Ghat, is to kind of come in, do the R&D with external funding, but then demonstrate to the government why they should be putting their money towards scaling and sustaining this. And that would be a testimony to our success, if we can exit a state or we can exit a community with it being completely sustained by government money.
Thank you. Zhao, you've been waiting patiently, so go for it.
No, I just want to really, actually, first of all, to really repeat what Punya said. I actually, I have a hard time dealing with nonprofits. Azra, that's not a point. Because I really think in the US, Punya, I think grant money, people, private donations, they really don't last. When they have money, they spend. It's not that, okay, I love Bill Gates' money, it's good. There's people, they made a lot of money, they should spend on it. But I actually like the idea of Aditya, especially what you are trying to do, replace textbooks. One of the big problems in schools is that it's not that schools don't have money, schools spend money in the wrong way. So that is, I think. So my question really, has a lot. So I'm going to talk a little bit more before we got into the question. Another point I was trying to say is that, we've had so much technology in schools. There's so many people trying to get rid of Pearson, or the textbooks, all those kind of things. And, we have smart devices, we got internet, we have all of this. I mean, I came from China. I went to grad school with Punya in the US. So we've been in the US as long as Punya has. And if you go to China, even the best schools, their traditional classes, they're not using smartphones. Governments, even the French government bans use of smart devices. New York just banned the use of ChatGPT. So it's so hard what you guys are trying to do. So I want to comment on your efforts. You're trying, Azra said you're very optimistic. In 5 years, things might change. And may or may not, I don't know. So in 5 years, we should have another episode to talk about, well, what do you think? Punya and I have gone through, I'm sure Chris, we all have gone through 5 years, 3 years. It was really interesting. So actually, my question has nothing to do with any of those. My question really has to do with ChatGPT. I just got a lot of emails, people talk about this because it's become popular. It's banned in China, but it's actually Chinese people are secretly using it. And of course, in the US. So I was just wondering, you guys, both of you have a strong technology background, and also think about human-computer interface. How do you think ChatGPT or other AI coming out? And I saw another guy from Stability AI said, you guys are all going to die in 2023 because of, ChatGPT and other investment, because, their diffusion kind of model was not working. I don't know the specifics. So I really would like to hear your comments. It could change education forever, reading or those kind of, it may be shut out by schools forever. So we don't know. So I just like to hear your expert comments on that. Any one of you can go first.
Azra, maybe do you want to go first?
I mean, interestingly, we were actually having a conversation about this just yesterday. So that topic is very fresh on our minds. So I think one thing with whether it's ChatGPT or whether it's like VR or whether it's these STEM tools, like all of these are finally tools of different kinds, right? Like I think a lot of focus ends up being on what these tools can do versus like how we are trying to use them and whether we even understand how these operate and what they're capable of. And I think, ChatGPT is going to be there, and you're always going to have students who are really smart and find ways to game the system if they want to. But the question is more around whether they understand what this, and they need to know how to use ChatGPT, because this is just like part of our reality now. Like we are going to have such tools available, and if they don't use it, someone else is going to compete and use it with them. But are they able to even use it effectively? Are they able to ask the right prompts of this ChatGPT tool? Are they able to assess the responses they get from the ChatGPT critically? And actually, maybe this is where you can talk you can talk about the critical thinking piece that we were discussing more, maybe, Aditya. Like that was, I think, one thing that came up for us. Like just that this brings up really interesting questions about what critical thinking means in this kind of context. And you can no longer just, focus on just like rote learning answers, because ChatGPT can give you that. But there other kinds of questions you need to be asking instead.
I'll start with saying a couple of things. One is, I think the approach of banning the use of it in schools and classrooms is not the right way to be handling this. With New York school system, I think was the big one in the United States that said that this is completely banned. I think that is not the right way to be approaching this. And I actually think it's excellent that we're talking about ChatGPT and we're talking about these tools in the context of learning, because now all of a sudden you have to face head on the realities of what the goals are of education. What is the fundamental goal of K-12 systems? What is the fundamental goal of taking our kids, our next generation of learners, through so many years of schooling? Is the goal to fill the mind with information about the world? Clearly not. I mean, Google destroyed that understanding or that assumption, because you had search engines that could gather information and sort information better than you could. So you don't have to memorize when the First World War happened. You don't have to memorize the second law of motion, because you need to rather understand how to use it and how to do it. And now we have another layer of abstraction that has been automated by machines around kind of generating critical kind of responses, generating responses that involve multiple sources of information, which is amazing, I think, because and I think what Azra was trying to refer to was what we were talking about yesterday, which is, in order to effectively use ChatGPT, you still need to know what to ask it. If you do not have the ability to ask high quality questions, it's only going to give you answers that are at that same level. And so instead of rejecting and banning these new tools, I think we need to be asking questions of what are ways in which we should be teaching our students to think and teaching our students to problem solve, and how is that going to change? Is problem solving now just being able to look at different bodies of information and come up with some sort of response that takes into account multiple sources of information? Well, maybe not enough, because these AI tools can do that as well, if not better, than you can. Is it now learning how to leverage that sort of intelligence to be able to ask more nuanced questions, to be able to ask the right sorts of prompts? Maybe that's the approach. Maybe that's the way in which we need to be shifting our idea of teaching problem solving or teaching critical thinking skills to our kids. So I think it's excellent, because I think it forces you to grapple with the foundations of standardized testing, forces you to grapple with the foundations of kind of textbook publishing, which is in many ways amplifying this idea of an assembly line of learners, assembly line of students. Kind of that's the whole idea, right? I mean, so many of our education systems around the world, especially in Asia, especially in China and India, are relics of kind of the industrial revolution age, where you needed to build an assembly line of clerks or people that could just do things like a computer. And now that whole system is going to start crumbling because of the recognition that machines can do this better than we can.
So thank you guys for that expert analysis. Now, actually, I'm going to get into even deeper, because you both work with schools, with teachers, teacher trainings, school leaders. And so in that space, for example, how are you going to convince the New York City to say, yeah, banning is really a bad idea, it's stupid, yeah, bring them in? So when you are working, because this then, of course, as it's going to develop, it's going to become better, so whatever you can do or cannot do, we cannot really predict yet exactly. What we need to think about is that, how do teachers and how do schools let them in? Like when you said, students have to learn how to do it. The technical aspect of using ChatGPT or similar tools will be simple. The technicality is simple. It's the content, it's the thinking. But how do we get them in? Into schools? It's that, I guess I was saying, they're banning even smart devices, So how are you going, what are you think you can do? And because schools well and you work with schools, I think, so I'm just curious, what do you guys think?
Can I just jump in 1 second, Zhao? I saw this
sure.
quote. I saw this quote yesterday, which I thought was like really, it was an article and I was reading something, and said that, the problem is, like, the reason we are banning this stuff is because we are worried about the disruption it's going to cause to our lives, while we are not thinking about like these kids are going to grow up and live in a world which is going to be disrupted by these technologies, right? I mean, it comes to the fundamental issue of what the hell education is for, and
I
we
mean,
are
there was
seeing
a
it so short
time,
term. Yeah.
right.
So
And I mean,
short-sighted.
and there was a time where the printing press was banned, right? I mean, it was seen as something that was ruining the minds of our children, and that reading was going to cause our children to go blind. Like there is documented information of people that were kind of rejecting and going down and burning those early printing press devices and machines. And so I think technological evolution, it just goes through those cycles of kind of ups and downs where and here's kind of the way I think about it is when someone tells us from like looking at Inspirit, for example, they're like, this technology like VR is too out there, it's not for my kids. I don't want my kids to be kind of like this is going to ruin the way they think, the way they problem solve. They should be actually like we shouldn't be putting our kids in headsets and all of that. And I think that's a very valid argument, but you also have to recognize that these kids are coming from the worlds of Roblox and Minecraft. They're living in realities where they are part of virtual experiences on a daily basis, where they are not just consumers of information, but they're actively creating information and creating knowledge as well in these interactive 3D digital worlds. Same thing with AI tools and chatbots. We can reject it in the classroom, but these kids are interacting with them everywhere on social media, through various smart devices in their environments and in their surroundings. So you're actually not teaching them the skills of how to think critically about using and engaging with them in the real world when you say that we should be banning these in the classroom. Rather, your approach should be that these are inevitable. Like these are going to be part of everyday life, not going to, they already are part of everyday life for our kids. These kids are seeing these and actively engaging with these on a daily basis. So maybe we should be teaching children on how to understand what information, how to process information. Like, is this high quality information or is this fake information? Because there's so many instances of ChatGPT summarizing an academic paper and just fabricating academic evidence, right? And it's not 100% accurate. And maybe it will become accurate, but teaching our children how to process information, how to critically engage with information might be the way we should be thinking about integrating and addressing these new technological changes, and not just blanket bans.
Yeah, and I think we also underestimate like our kids kind of repeatedly. Even if you're going to ban these tools, they will find a way to use them, whether it's for their coursework or not. They are going to explore it, they're going to kind of learn how to use it. They'll probably be ahead of their teachers in terms of it. And the danger there is that if they're in a place that they don't truly understand what these tools are capable of, they aren't able to critically evaluate what kinds of responses they're getting from these tools, then you're moving in a whole other direction in which you don't want to go. So either you can kind of guard against those things, make sure our kids are ready to be working with these tools and getting the most out of them, or the kids will find their own ways. They're going to explore them anyway. Banning is not going to change that.
So I want to talk about teachers. And I have a lot of experience in helping teachers to shift to experiential learning. I myself, with my colleagues, build the kinds of learning experiences that are experiential, and I've also watched a lot of other people. And there's at least two major barriers that I see again and again with many teachers in experiential learning. The first one is that teachers have been taught psychology that's way out of date. They're taught behaviorist psychology, essentially, about learning, which is all the way from the first half of the 20th century and has been superseded by many, many better depictions of how the mind works. And behaviorist psychology says you can't learn anything complicated until you learn all the simple parts. And you say that to parents and school board members and stakeholders, and they say, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And then, of course, it's lethal when you try to do it, because teachers will, they turn an experiential lesson into a very elaborate charade of following directions. But the other thing, even when you get past that, is that experiential learning involves productive frustration. Kids get stuck. And appropriately so, because when you're learning something new and you're not getting deluged with supports, then you do get stuck and you have to figure it out. And the figuring out is, in fact, the core skill that you're trying to teach. But a lot of teachers, the minute they see kids getting frustrated, will jump in. They have sort of a deficit model about students. Oh, you're stuck, let me help you. And then it undercuts the whole point of the experience. I think that, in fact, experiential teaching is hard because you have to recognize the line between productive frustration and unproductive frustration and intervene when students hit that line, but not prematurely. So I'm wondering, first, whether these observations resonate with you and whether you have others that you would add. And second, to what extent do you need to do capacity building for the teachers you work with in order for them to use the learning experiences that you're developing?
I think, I mean, I 100% agree with all of these things you're saying. I will say I've observed a lot of teacher training workshops tend to teach teachers how to teach. That I think is a huge limitation of the way in which we do teacher training. I think there's serious inquiry that we need to go into, that we need to do into kind of moving from a series of slides that have a list of bullet points on the best practices of how to do XYZ to maybe looking at experiential learning in teacher training itself, like maybe role-playing good and bad examples of productive frustration, going through scenario-based kind of demonstrations, I think are the way in which we should be looking at doing teacher training in classrooms and in spaces. Having said that, this idea of productive frustration, even this idea of kind of failure being critical to this idea of experiential learning, like you want students to fail, is difficult to scale. Because the moment you start thinking about scaling this, it becomes tricky because now you're trying to productize your offering, you're trying to discretize it, and you dilute the kind of nature, that nature of that creative inquiry, that creative exploration, which is foundational to kind of this whole idea of experiential learning. And I think that's where we're looking at kind of really doing a lot of work, at least in the context of Maker Ghat, around like, how do you scale high quality teacher training? How do you scale this idea of teaching teachers to allow their students to fail? Because especially in an Indian context, these are kids who are coming from classrooms and spaces where they are constantly being told what to do. And they are not in spaces where they're given the agency or the freedom to explore. Therefore, when they are, very often they don't know what to do. There is fear that is created. It's like, I'll give you a simple example. I remember in our early days of Maker Ghat, we had a bunch of the Arduino and Raspberry Pi controllers and microprocessors that we used to use to teach students basic logic, basic programming, basic electronics. And a lot of students would hesitate to utilize those microprocessors and those sensors in their projects because they were worried that if they put a battery of a different rating, they would short circuit it and they would break it or they would damage it, and then they'd have to pay for this device, and they didn't have the money to pay for it. And there was fear of failure. And a big thing that we did in the design and the physical design of our maker spaces was to celebrate failure to begin with, which is when you fail, everyone should start giving you a standing ovation because that means you tried something and it didn't work. So I think that is a fundamental cultural shift that we have to create in terms of creating opportunities for giving students agency, number one, and then also encouraging that idea of productive failure, that kind of that process of failing until you succeed. You are right though, in kind of when a teacher should intervene to ensure that you aren't just not supporting, not scaffolding that process, because I think some amount of scaffolding is critical to ensure that the intervening of the instructor or the expert happens at the right time. And that's where I think role-playing, scenario-based teacher training needs to be a key focus. Now, it gets very hard in a Maker Ghat context because we're working at the scale of, say, 1,000 schools or even larger now, where you are going to train the trainer who's going to then train the teacher. So you have 2 or 3 degrees of training. that happen. You train a group of 300 people, they go and train 30,000 people because you have 30,000 teachers teaching in 10,000 schools across the state. That's kind of the scale that we're looking at, and Azra can share more. And we're asking these questions of like, what is the teaching loss that happens at every stage? Can you measure that? Can you find ways to kind of improve that kind of reduce the loss or improve the process in which information is disseminated? Because you don't want to have a game of telephone where you train a trainer, they train someone else, and they train someone else, and at the very end, what you have is something that's not what you originally aspired to do. So those are some very challenging things on scale, where it becomes very hard for you to sustain quality of an experiential learning program when you have to think about doing this at scale.
Azra, do you have?
I mean, I think like Aditya's response was pretty comprehensive. I think like there are two levels at which we've been thinking about training. There's always the first hurdle, which has been just getting even used to the idea of working with your hands and engaging in experiential learning. That in itself has been a huge kind of mental shift that we've had to address, because no longer do you have this kind of concrete way of saying that, okay, like if you're getting like a 10 out of 10 on this test, then the goals of this module have been achieved, right? Like you no longer have those kinds of concrete kind of touch points for these teachers. So that's been one kind of mental shift that has been really hard. But the other piece, like you said, like I think part of it has been, knowing when to intervene in let's say a project that a student is doing, but also how to manage a class. How do you manage your time effectively? How do you even use the materials that you're provided, like teacher guides and such? There's so many pieces of it that are new to the teachers that they've just never had to deal with, because they're used to just using like a traditional textbook and then teaching a lecture and then being able to move on, that we've had to address. And I'll say that there's a lot more work still that needs to happen. Like I think we've only really scratched the surface there. Like we still kind of just gotten over the first hurdle and starting to deal with all of these other pieces. But it's especially difficult to think about those pieces at scale. But I mean, I think everything you said resonated. These are all questions that we're thinking about and figuring out new ways to address, whether it's in training or whether it's in terms of ongoing support with teachers.
Punya.
Sure. So one of our co-hosts, Kurt, is not here today. So I'm going to try and channel him with sort of a question that he asks. But I'm just curious about one thing, like both of you have undergraduate degrees in engineering, am I correct? Okay, so this is what's hilarious is we've had 4 episodes on education in India, which means 8 guests and one me co-host of Indian origin. All of us have undergraduate degrees in engineering, which I thought was hilarious that, but at some level, you guys are still working in sort of the tech space. Many of the other ones have completely left that behind and are fully in sort of the education space, which I just think is like super interesting. It tells you something, I'm not exactly sure what, but so to channel Kurt, I think one of the things he always asks is sort of the journey that brought our guests to where they are, because I think that's a really good question, because it sort of is a model for others as well. So I know when I, for instance, wanted to move into education, it was a big shock to my mother, for instance. So she would tell everybody that he's doing computer graphics, as a way of like not saying like design, because my master's was in design and then I moved to education. It was a matter of some shame, I guess. I don't know, because she would never honestly say what I was doing. So particularly in a context like India, like when you're moving into this education space and so on, I think hopefully things have changed a little bit since I went through my college. But I would love to hear sort of your story of how you guys came to this space, how you, like what motivated you, what are things that if somebody's interested in such a, path would like to think about. Go ahead. Either one of you can start this one off.
Aditya, you can go first.
Are you sure? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I remember when I was like 18 or 19, I remember I'm from Chennai, and I remember one of my holidays at home in a summer break, I chose to kind of just take a bus and go to a rural school, just because I had realized that I had gone to like I'd gone to a Delhi public school my entire life, and I had not really seen any sort of school that was outside of a city. So I remember just wanting to go and just be useful. I remember going to a very rural school around 2 hours away from Chennai, into the classroom, and typical kind of rural panchayat village school. The kids are sitting on the floor. There is a teacher. There's more kids than there should be in a small space. And there's lots of noise. It's like it's a complete festival, right, of what's happening in the classroom. And I remember walking up to the teacher and being like, look, I'm an engineer. I can build apps. I can build websites. I can do all these cool things. Tell me how I can solve all your problems. And I remember her just like laughing at me, and being like, what problems? And that's when I realized, I looked around and I realized that that classroom had an iPad that was donated by, I don't know, like Pratham, one of these big NGOs in the country. That classroom had a Wi-Fi router that was given by the previous government that was in power, that had donated Wi-Fi routers to all these villages. That classroom had a television monitor as well. That classroom had a bunch of tech. There were tablets, there were computers, there was a Wi-Fi router in this rural village. But all of these devices were collecting dust. And I asked a teacher, like, have you used the iPad? And she was like, I don't even know where the charger is, so we can't charge it. We've misplaced it like long ago. And when the NGO comes to visit us, then we kind of turn it on because we want to show that we're using it because they donated it. And then when they go, we leave it. And that's when I kind of foundationally realized that we were taking a very kind of tech deterministic way of problem solving in this context, in this space, where it was all about like technology is this hammer and let's start looking for nails that we can start beating with this technology. And we were not taking a bottom-up way, a kind of teacher first way or a classroom first way of understanding what the gaps were, understanding what the opportunities were for integrating and building these tools. So to me, it was really spending a lot of time. I spent multiple months, years in these spaces, rural, urban, public, private, like all shapes and sizes of classrooms and schools, where I realized that I had a lot of power as an engineer, as a builder of these tools. And I chose to consciously do a PhD in education because I believed that the technology, the technical side of things was well understood, but the human side of things, the learning side of things was not. And that was where there was opportunity for academic work. There was opportunity for building rigor. And I truly believe that if you're an education technology entrepreneur building these tools, you have to have a deep understanding of something like the learning sciences. Otherwise, you're going to be inevitably leading to building products that might cause more harm, or might cause harm that you may not have seen or noticed intuitively if you took a pure engineering lens to development or building these tools. So that to me was the journey. I also come from a home where my mother was a school teacher, and I was always very inspired with kind of her kind of journey and her work. And to me, my goal has always been to also become a teacher. So I think when I'm done with Inspirit, I want to kind of teach in K-12. That would always be something that would make me the happiest.
Yeah, I think my journey into this space was definitely different. So I had like a somewhat unorthodox set of experiences with the education system growing up. My dad's side of the family is originally from a small town in Bihar called Samastipur, and we had this interesting setup where the place where I was staying also functioned as a small local private school, and that was run by my uncle, kind of heavily heavily kind of funded on charity and philanthropy and such. And I could see all the places where the education system broke down from the inside out. There was like at every stage, whether it was with just managing school schedules, whether it was in terms of finding teachers to teach a certain subject, whether in terms of grading, making sure students had the right support, disciplinary action. There were so many places where there were just so many gaps. And I think that kind of left an indelible mark on me. And I think like similar to Aditya, a lot of my family members were involved in education in some way. So I had an aunt also in the same town who was working in a government madrasa. So she was teaching there. So she would bring like these these exam papers that she was grading back home, and I could see just how much students were struggling to answer very basic questions. So there was just like a lot of like the system was just so broken in so many ways. And what was really I think frustrating was that if you talk to the students one-on-one, or if you meet them outside of school context, they're brilliant. Like they have so much to share. They have so much knowledge from their communities that are just like completely missed in the education system, right? And then, I mean, I kind of had like a series of experiences with the social sector. I kind of started my undergrad in computer engineering in like a completely different space. And then I kind of was like, no, I want to kind of go back here and figure out how I can apply my skills in ways that are maybe connecting back to those contexts that I was that had kind of left this mark on me. And then I kind of had this opportunity to work with youth in India. So again, like these were kids who were really like falling through the cracks of the education system, but brilliant otherwise. Like there was this young guy called Satyam and Dheeraj who like did very average in their board exams and such at the 10th and 12th grade level, but they were always tinkering. They were learning to do computer repair. They were picking up like pieces and building their own robots and things like that. So and also like doing like part-time jobs and such just to manage their their household income and such. So I think like that's for me a lot of the entry point has been more in terms of like youth agency and kind of finding ways and spaces where young people can thrive. And of course, like some of the like strongest change agents we have in our communities are teachers. But unfortunately, our systems are not set up always in a way to empower them. So I think it's partly been like, okay, how do we work within the systems we have and do what we can, but also how can we inspire these young people who have so much energy, who are falling through the cracks, to kind of inspire them and give them the space and give them the resources and materials to do what they are capable of doing. They know what they want, they know what they need, but can we create that culture, that environment where they can thrive? So that's been kind of the entry point for me. I think it's a hard space to be in because like I think unfortunately the Indian school system is very kind of like master kind of student versus like, oh, we all have something to offer and knowledge to offer here. But it's been an interesting journey for sure. Yeah.
Before
Thank you. Yeah.
so we got about Rainy 3 minutes, but before you guys joined the show, I always thought Punya was the only engineer betrayer, the only guy who left engineering. But apparently India overproduces engineering students. But I think the question really goes back to what Chris was talking about. We train teachers, we prepare, so we can view schools like Azra said. Schools can be a prison. Schools can be a place for opportunities, right? So some people say we got to go to school. The same thing happens everywhere, not only India. We want kids to have education, but education equals schooling. Do you see what I mean? So I'm just really want you guys, the two of you, brave enough to project, is it possible or is it happening that they are building non-schools online? So if a student doesn't fit in one village, why can't the student go study somewhere else? Take a course from Chris Steeding out of Harvard, or Punya. So just very quickly, we got only 3 minutes. Thank you, guys.
I have a quick comment on that, which is, I think a big goal for us from a Maker Ghat kind of lens is to, in many ways, change the idea of what success looks like. For a lot of our children that we work with, the idea of a successful person is somebody that went to an IIT. They went to IIT Bombay. They went to they ranked #1 in the top medical college or the top law college, whatever it is, right? It's somebody that ranked first in the standardized exam and went to an IIT. Now, the reality is for most of the students we work with, they don't have the same agency or the same resources as somebody in a privileged city has, with all the tutoring, the one-to-one support, all the other technology resources they have to crack and succeed in the IIT. So in many ways for us, the idea of Maker Ghat is if you create spaces where kids can play, where kids can tinker, where kids can learn, you might create role models who are local down the road. In 10 years, in 15 years, the idea of success should no longer be that kid from the urban city that went into IIT, but the idea of success should be that person next door that built a water filter that improved water quality for my entire village, because they identified a way in which they could improve the quality of water that was coming out of the tap, or somebody that innovated in something on the farming side of things and found a way to increase crop yield in their neighborhood, and now was somebody that was generating revenue for themselves. And so this idea, India has always been a country of small business entrepreneurs. It always has been a country of lineages of vocations and skilling that has been passed down the line. And somewhere along the way, you'll see, especially a city like Mumbai or Bombay, is just a city of migrants. It's all kids who have come from rural towns, rural villages, left agriculture, left farming, left their traditional skills, their vocations, and have come to the city to find a job, and find a job in typically in engineering or in tech. And you unfortunately have this idea of role models that do not look like them, that are not like them, that are not from where they are from. And so a big goal for us is to shift this idea of role models to local leaders, to local supporters. And to do that, you have to break down the four walls of the classroom, kind of to your point that you said earlier. A classroom is not limited to that physical space that they're in. A classroom has to be something that engages with their community, with their environment, with their surroundings, as well as with the world of digital resources that exist online.
Yeah, I mean, I think like, yeah, 100% with the whole goal, the role of having local leaders and people who you can aspire to be in some sense, right? Like just the fact that you can see what's out there and you can build their exposure, that makes a huge difference. I mean, in terms of, I think like how to kind of make that happen, right? I think we're seeing some of that happen organically, where we see some of these students who, like in older students who have finished our program, come back, mentor other students, and kind of build that kind of network. But there's definitely more scaffolding that can happen more kind of explicitly as well, and create more pipelines into these kind of alternative ways of mentorship and training and such. I think, unfortunately, the way the system is set up right now is that we are very focused on certificates and degrees and such. And until that barrier is broken, it's going to be very hard for someone with an alternative training or pathway to kind of break back into like get a job after having gone through a different kind of training. So I think that is the other kind of barrier that we still need to address to be able to fully take advantage of all these alternative pathways that someone could take in terms of their careers.
So all of us want to thank both of you. Your work is very inspirational. Working to scale, you're reaching a huge number of people. I'm hoping that as others watch this episode, they might look at what you're doing as a model and ask, well, in my country, could I do something like this? So thank you very much for everything that you're doing. I'm going to quickly talk about our episode next week, which will be at the usual time of 5:30 p.m. Eastern. It's about learning experience design and personalized learning. We have a couple guests. I've known one of them for decades, Mark Milliron, who's now president of National University, and the other is Associate Dean at Teachers College of Western Governors University, which is another very innovative organization. And we look forward to a stimulating conversation about how to involve learners in the instruction that they receive. So thanks for everything, and see you